Hi, I'm Henry Brem. I'm the Harvey Cushing professor at Johns Hopkins and the chief of neurosurgery. And I'm very happy to share with you some thoughts about the great Harvey Cushing, who had such an enormous impact on American medicine, on really world medicine, on neurosurgery, endocrinology, anesthesia, and so many other fields. Cushing was a fascinating person. He came from a line of physicians. His father, grandfather, and great-grandfather were all physicians, prominent physicians in Cleveland, Ohio. He went to Yale as an undergraduate and then Harvard Medical School, and he did his internship at the Mass General. In 1896, he came to Hopkins to train and do his surgical training under William Halsted, one of the founders of American surgery. He trained here in his residency under Halsted from 1896 till about 1900. He then went overseas, which was typical in that era, to visit the great European clinics of surgery and see what they were doing with brain surgery. And he returned to Hopkins in 1901 on the faculty as an instructor. And he stayed here until 1912. That period of time, he revolutionized American medicine. He was the first person to carry out successfully brain tumor surgery. At the time that he started, there was over a 90% mortality if somebody had an operation for brain tumor. By the end of Cushing's career, it was less than 10%. He discovered and understood the role of the pituitary gland, both the tumors and how they manifested themselves, developed operations for treating them, and really was the foundation and one of the fathers of modern day endocrinology. From his European trip, he brought back the anesthesia sheets of monitoring a patient when they're under anesthesia, and that was really the forerunner of modern anesthesia today. He also brought back the early blood pressure cuffs of monitoring blood pressure. Things that we take for granted today were unheard of in that time. He's also credited as bringing the first X-ray machine to Johns Hopkins. He took that from Boston, from when he was a medical student and intern there, and brought it to Hopkins, and is credited with having the first surgical X-ray that was used for surgery. It was a bullet in the skull, and he showed the bullet, and he then went ahead and removed it. So in so many ways, he was the first and developed the techniques of things that we take for granted today. And clearly in the field of neurosurgery, his approach was truly revolutionary. One other major area that he contributed to during that Hopkins period of his career was the establishment of the Hunterian laboratory. And again, it's something we take for granted today, but he developed the concept of the surgeon, clinician, scientist training in the laboratory and also doing experimental work and making it complementary to their clinical work. And that Hunterian laboratory continues to today to be a place where neurosurgeons and other surgeons take ideas from the operating room, bring it to the laboratory, and then back into the clinic. But the foundation of that and the vision that was a critical part of being an academic surgeon came from Harvey Cushing. Another major role that Cushing had was as a teacher and as an educator. And it's all the early neurosurgeons were in some way touched or trained by Harvey Cushing. He was a very harsh teacher. His style was very demanding, very unforgiving. He was very hard on himself and on his own family, but he was very difficult to work with. But everybody who worked with him realized that they were in the presence of greatness and that they were part of something that was extraordinary, because he was treating diseases that had been previously incurable, and he was showing it with meticulous Halstedian technique, which he learned from Halsted, this meticulous dissection, minimal blood loss. Eventually, in his later years at Harvard, he later developed cauteries that were used in the surgery, the Bovie, was named after an MIT collaborator of his, and he introduced that to surgery in order to obtain that goal of meticulous surgery with minimal blood loss, so essential to brain surgery. He operated on people that no one else could do, and he took on incredible operations and really established the way in the standards that we use today and based on his work. He also was incredibly critical of his own findings. His publications were not, you know, look how great I am. They were very, very analytical about the errors that were made and what needed to be improved, as well as the successes that he had. As a teacher, he was harsh and demanding, but the people who trained under him became the leaders around the country and around the world in this newly developed field of neurosurgery. In fact, his classic paper on the special field of neurosurgery, which he gave in Cleveland, I believe, in 1906, where he describes the special field of neurosurgery. What he describes in that paper, he said that temporarily, under the permission and guidance of William Halsted, he was given the privilege at Johns Hopkins of specializing in surgery of the nervous system. And he said that the field had developed into a separate specialty, which was neurosurgery. And that paper and that work is credited as the birth of modern neurosurgery. He was recognized around the world as one of the great physicians of the time. The neurosurgical, he thought it was very important that the neurosurgeons be collegial with each other and share their experiences. And in fact, the Harvey Cushing Society, which today is the American Association of Neurological Surgeons, was formed as a group that met with Cushing from all over the world, which at that time was about 40 neurosurgeons, and they would meet and they would compare results and really compare the teachings that he had imparted to them. One of his students is Walter Dandy, who was the Hunterian Fellow working in his laboratory when he was a medical student at Johns Hopkins. Dandy expected that when Cushing left in 1911 to be the first chairman of the surgery department at the Brigham, that he would join him. But then at the last moment, Cushing decided to leave Dandy and his research here at Hopkins alone. And Dandy continued his training under Halsted and became the dominant neurosurgeon here at Hopkins. That discordance between them became a lifelong feud, which led to two major schools of neurosurgery. The Cushing, conservative, meticulous dissection, and some of the more bold, innovative ideas that Walter Dandy developed. And the two of them sort of went at each other throughout both their careers, although clearly everybody else in the field realized that these were two extraordinary giants. So Cushing was extraordinarily prolific, and he had a sense in his writing both of the importance of communicating through publications, whether it was books, articles, and certainly his lectures, but also he had a sense of history in his writing, that he wanted to document what he was doing throughout his life, what he was thinking, what he observed when he traveled, and certainly what he observed in the operating room and in his clinical practice. It's said that if you took all of Cushing's writings, that it boiled down to his writing about an average of 20 pages every single day of his life. If you look at his published work, so extraordinarily prolific. After an operation, he would write down all his thoughts about the operation. He also was a very gifted artist, and he would make drawings of places that he visited, his books on his experience as a military surgeon, for example, in World War I, are very richly illustrated. All his illustrations were done by himself. throughout Europe. He has these different illustrations of what he saw, what war was like as a military surgeon. But then the classic illustrations are really in his time here at Hopkins and later at Harvard, when he went as chief of surgery. Of every operation he drew at the end. He was fortunate to have Max Brodel, the great medical illustrator, as his personal tutor, and he hired artists to work in the department of surgery to work with him and illustrate along with him. But he himself was a gifted artist who took a lot of pride in being able to show through art what he was actually accomplishing with each operation. He also wrote prolifically about philosophy. And in fact, one of the amazing things about him is, aside from this incredible surgeon, incredible endocrinologist, anesthesiologist, all these fields that he changed, he also won a Pulitzer Prize for his biography of his mentor and his great friend, William Osler. So when Osler passed away, his wife asked Cushing to pull together his papers and to put together his life story. And in that biography, it was an incredible depiction of the man who changed modern medicine, William Osler, and he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for that great contribution. He was nominated many times for the Nobel Prize for his contributions, particularly to understanding the role and function of the pituitary. Of course, there's Cushing's reflex, increase intracranial pressure. He was a great physiologist. He understood how the brain, cerebrospinal fluid, blood pressure all interacted, and in different syndromes, how they manifested themselves. As a person, he could, according to the many books and articles written about him, he could vary between being a charming, delightful person that people would just love to socialize with and tell great stories and be very funny, to being a very harsh taskmaster, which most of the people's recollections with him depicted. He was very unforgiving, very, very demanding, and demeaning sometimes of the people around him. The medical school administrations found him intolerable. When he finished his tenure as chief of surgery at Harvard Medical School, there was a strong feeling that the dean and the people at the hospital did not want him to continue, and he was very bitter about that, but he had no tolerance for anything administrative or anything that got in his way, and he just felt that he was the most important person in the room, not just the smartest person in the room at all times. There's an anecdote of that his daughter married FDR's son, and he told his daughter that he might not be able to attend her wedding because he was so important and so busy, but that if he didn't walk her down the aisle, his chauffeur would walk her down, and what's the difference? And of course he did eventually, but there's a famous story about that he went to the White House to see FDR, his daughter's father-in-law, unannounced, and he just went up to the president's office and said, "I'm Harvey Cushing, I'm here to see, FDR." And they said, "You don't have an appointment?" And he said, "Just tell him that I'm here, of course he'll see me." And he did, but about an hour later, and according to this anecdote, Cushing said, "Don't ever keep me waiting an hour. Nobody keeps me waiting. My time is more precious than that." And that's also the type of person that he was. So here's a person who went into a field that everybody died, that nobody survived, that nobody had been successful in really making meaningful advances. And he was willing to take that on, and he changed it. And he changed medicine in doing that. But he was not an easy person to live with or to work with, for that matter, although people did recognize that what he was doing had good intentions and was revolutionary.